Good morning.
Good morning. Evening.
Good evening and good morning. Yeah, I'm still kind of adjusting to my time change, but I think I'm mostly over it.
You had a
It
remarkable trip.
was a good trip. It's a good trip. Austria is very nice. Yeah.
You thought it
Were
was
the
great.
croissants better there?
Yes, all of the pastry is better. Yeah, and also not quite as sweet. It doesn't suffer from kind of the excessive sweetness of a lot of our pastry. Mark, you're in Utah. Okay, cool. Um, all right, good to see you. Anyway, so I've been actually impressed by this week's book. I think that somebody ought to do a series on how Hayek has been misunderstood. um, and the things that are relevant. I don't know. Maybe I'll say some things uh, in some type of forum about the things that I think are relevant but haven't been addressed in the stuff that I've been seeing in these first chapters. So
Well, I
how are
will
things
say,
going for everybody? How's the reading going? How's life going?
well, before we dive off your intro paragraph there, and the guy called Lewis that I keep pointing you at, who is Tik on YouTube, is a big fan of Hayek. And one of the things he's frequently drops into his videos is the misunderstanding.
Okay.
So
The difference between the Reader's Digest, although it's kind of interesting because in the introduction, it didn't really address, what we've run into that in the past where people have said, well, Hayek was responsible, but
yeah,
the Reader's Digest was not, kind of thing. And that didn't seem to be present in the description of, how the Reader's Digest had made the road to serfdom
so far,
such a thing in
so
America very early on.
so so far, there's the uh, he seems to leap into the conversation as though you've already had 2 days worth of conversation before.
In
That's
the in the
in the sense
introduction
of
or in the text itself.
in the text. Uh, Whereas I thought because we're looking at this the version by Bruce, whatever his name, Caldwell. So you've got the like 3 or 4 different intros, stroke prefaces, straightforward
Hmm.
that give you a flavour of other people and or I suppose quite good roundups of the book. I've also liked his own preface and the intro, which gives quite a bit of context in other relationships, but it's rather like Pat said about the fact that he repeats stuff and
Hmm.
it's an oddball style. And although the editors tried to shuffle things around in terms of in this country equals England,
Hmm.
which I sort of semi rebel. Now we're talking 1930s. It's been the UK for donkey's years,
Yeah.
and it's been the Great Britain and Northern Ireland for 10 plus years. Uh, there's still not quite definition, stroke qualification within the text, which I think is the biggest single rollover, particularly from my UK position, in terms of I've been to right-wing countries that were, I was in Spain and Portugal when they were still fascist
Hmm.
run. Yet, on a day-to-day basis, particularly albeit as a tourist, you didn't see much difference compared to when you're a day-to-day tourist in Italy or Germany or Austria,
Hmm.
all of which have been as bad, if not worse, albeit they've all been, Germany particularly been denazified, Austria got split back out again, etc.
Hmm.
There is still seems to be, and it may well be the problem that Hayek is tagged with, is there's no distinction between effectively a democratic socialist regime, using regime in the widest possible context,
Yeah. Hmm.
versus a totalitarian communist imposition like China, like Soviet Union,
Hmm.
because it's not clear that given that say Stalin was totalitarian, and what do we now call Putin's Russia?
Right. Right. Well, or
For
what,
instance,
what would we
so
call?
it comes over to me at the moment as a let's deliberately misunderstand some of the words and terminology
Mhm.
and not recognize the shades of grey. But I'm
Yeah.
willing to be convinced. But the and I must admit I haven't done it yet, partly because I was rushing to get the reading done. I haven't gone back. There was an early comment uh, which was tagged in with the Isaiah Berlin thing, which where he talked about um, in the intro, Bruce's intro
Hmm.
about the Karl Popper in friendship.
Hmm.
And Popper's somebody I've been following since university days because he was always flagged up as being a good place to follow, along with of for other reasons. Thomas couldn't through this, the paradigm change. So I'm quite interested in digging up on a bit on that. So there's another Hayek book that's been already mentioned in the first few intro pieces. That
Yeah.
is a Hayek on Hayek, I think it is. So it's
Hmm.
Hayek talking about his own correspondence and a couple of other people putting in bits and pieces. And likewise, there's this other Jewish Austrian who gets out and goes to the US early days. Markovo, and something anyway. And that seemed, and we understand Hayek not so much from his writing, but from his correspondence
Mm.
with this guy as a blow by blow evolution. We only see, obviously, to a certain extent, we see the final books or the final papers, etc. But we get the toing and froing and the discussions of how I'm thinking, what I'm thinking, what I'm doing from the correspondence with this guy. So that seems to be another thing that would be um, useful, not necessarily parallel, but after, especially if you've read No Hayek.
Hmm.
So that's that's the direction I might be going after this one.
Right. Does that include his correspondence with like Keynes that they quote in the introduction here?
Well, I saw that as being a comment, and and uh, Tick YouTuber has mentioned that a lot. So I was sort of, because it was more of an antagonistic one as opposed to friend, I'm thinking about this. What do you think?
Yeah.
A friendly criticism rather than a one that is clearly seriously antagonistic.
Albeit, very cordial, apparently.
I understood not in the sense of,
It's depicted in this as
well, I
him
think
more respectful
thinking,
and cordial than I had sort of expected it to be. Yeah.
all right, well, I think it might well be that we're early days in it,
Hmm.
whereas as and when we get further through a little bit of history, not necessarily up this just in this book, but further on, Hayek and Keynes I see as being not on friendly terms. But
Right.
that
Yeah.
again, I might be wrong, but it's I'm taking that as a lead out of Tick's comments more than anything at the moment.
Okay.
Um, but it was the copper. Keynes I've never really been that interested in, other than it's a name I know almost. Whereas as Popper and uh, Popper I know about and like some
Yeah.
of his stuff and revisit occasionally. And obviously this Austrian Jewish friend of his is new
Mhm.
to me, but it seemed to be a how to get under the skin of somebody
Yeah.
where they're likely to be more open than they are in a normal or a more normal public
Uh-huh.
academic debate.
Yeah.
So that's why I was thinking of them.
Mhm. I think it's interesting that yeah that this introduction sort of situates him, with not only Popper but Gardner Means and and Walter Lippmann and kind of all of these big American names that I think and I think that Keynes interests me especially in the context of Bretton Woods, I think, and this whole kind of because I think it does. I mean, historically, it does kind of bring us to that question that he's talking about, that Hayek himself is talking about in these first chapters of the idea of planning. What Mark was saying about planning with the kind of with a capital P in the chat, and whether or not you can have um, planning to or to what extent. I was just I've been sort of working around doing yard work and stuff, and one of the things that sort of I stopped and made a note of was where there's a section where he specifically talks about things that markets can't adjust. And he doesn't use the word externalities, but that's a huge one, right? That he sort of, and he describes a couple of instances of them, environmental effects or effects on workers that are not going to be uh, that aren't going to be amenable to that, to the type of adjustment that a market signal would send. And so there's clearly an appropriate role of government, not only in terms of creating things like a system of laws and a stable currency and all that sort of thing that we um, that we kind of that typical libertarianism
Yeah.
expects or says is the role of government. So it seems like it seems like the impression that I'm getting, I guess at least, is that that the argument that he's going to make is going to be more interesting and nuanced than what I was originally
Yeah.
expecting.
Well, I had the same feeling that Tim did, that I'm coming into a conversation that's ongoing
Mhm.
that I've missed some of. So it's like I feel like I haven't watched the news for 6 months, just probably almost maybe 5 months actually since the fire started. But
Mhm.
then when I watch the Sunday morning shows, I feel like I'm a little out of the loop of what some of the conversation is that's going on.
Yeah.
Um, and his style is a little quirky, so I'll agree with Patrick on that point. But I found myself, I skipped all the introductory stuff and just jumped right in because I figure, okay, I have heard enough about kind of who he is and kind of where he's coming from or where I think he's coming from based on what I hear in the zeitgeist,
Mhm.
which a lot of which seems untrue. But I also found myself going back to find the original publication date because I was like, okay, I need to situate myself into his milieu of the time versus us looking at him, you know, 75 years later almost,
Right.
um, which has been fascinating. So I'm trying to read it both as a thing of its time, but also kind of separately read it. What does it say about us now? And I don't know. I didn't anchor it in because I was thinking about it afterwards, but I was reminded of Chris Hedges' article about this last election being about the corporatists versus the oligarchs.
Mm.
And he is now saying roughly that the oligarchs won, the Elon Musks, the Facebooks, the big, multi-billionaires who are trying to control the world. And reading this now in that framing, it's almost like the idea of central government planning killing us is now been bifurcated and is happening on two separate wavelengths. One is the oligarchs are now doing the planning, and the government has ceded power to the oligarchs to allow them to do that,
Mhm.
which seems a little odd on the day after Musk is has left, but he's still there, he's still advising. But the other piece is kind of I don't know, a central planning of ideas, which is the culture war piece.
Mhm.
And because we've got people who are predisposed, he RFK seems to be towing the line and saying occasionally, yeah, go get vaccinated, even though he's the flag bearer of the anti-vaxxer movement. But that is a form of central planning of the government. We're going to go down this road. We need to central plan the social agenda.
Mm.
So there's two different types of social or planning that are going on now in the current government as I'm reading this. And it's the social piece and the social information is happening. And then separately, we've ceded government power to the oligarchy to run and central plan to their own ends what's going on there. So it's a much more complex thing happening now versus what was happening at the tail end of World War II in Hayek's context.
Because
Um,
there's more technocracy, right?
yeah. I mean,
Because,
we've shifted and gone through several iterations of other things
yeah.
versus in his time period, the phrase mixed economy, at least in the US, would have been much more prevalent, and no one speaks of it now.
Yeah.
Um, and instead we've gone through decades of post Reagan beware of the government, they're not here for you
Mhm.
rhetoric. um
Well, we've sort of doubled down on rhetoric, but and so the meanings have come to seem more black and white. But does that? But I think that that's slightly different from what you were talking about earlier about the kind of the technocracy um, kind of causing this administrative state. Because that reminds me a lot of sort of progressivism, and that's one of the things that in this development of kind of central planning and the fascination with and the approval of centrally planned organization. I'm curious where Hayek will see the problem begin because he seems to be aware of and okay with and I guess it's early stages yet in these first chapters, a lot of planning if it's in response to things like market signals. Um, so I'll be fascinated to see how he kind of makes that distinction. And it does strike me that yeah that what he's been talking about kind of identifying totalitarianism as the thing and saying that Nazism and Stalinism are not that different in that they're both totalitarian, regardless of what the sort of theoretical underpinnings of them are. I thought that was interesting.
Well, I'm kind of curious too what his or how the rest of all of it plays out too, because in his time period, you're looking at not only the socialism coming out of the communist movement from 1917, but you've got some of the world leaders of the Axis piece doing their own version of central planning
Mhm.
within the war, but not related to the war. And then at the same time, you have a separate version of central planning happening in the US and Britain and other countries where we're doing some form of central planning to win the war with the kind of unwritten promise that when this is over, we'll go back to not central planning.
Right.
So, yeah, we're going to shut down typewriter manufacture in the United States and
Mhm.
switch it over to guns and ammunition. So, yeah, Remington,
Right.
who had gone into the typewriter business,
Mhm.
because they needed to diversify after the Civil War,
Right.
can shut that factory off and start using it for something else because they already have the expertise.
Yeah.
Um, and similarly for the others didn't have the firearms and the munitions expertise, but they could manufacture things and they had steel smelting, they could make parts, they could do the thing.
Mhm.
So you can shut things down roughly. I think most of them quit by
Yeah.
mid 42 and
Yeah.
we're doing making other things. But
Right.
that's a form of central planning that corporations to some extent also took advantage of as a
Right.
patriotic thing
Well, and
rather
in
than
the
the
in
government
the
saying you have to do this.
right, the most up to date or the most recent of the introductions does mention that, sort of and suggests that Hayek is going to somewhere in the text, and I haven't got to it yet, is going to sort of refer to that idea of emergency wartime planning and actually calls out the introduction calls out, things, the war on drugs, the war on terror, these things that are very distinctive because they don't have a method of ending them and saying, we've
Yeah.
had a victory or we've had a defeat and now it's definitively over and we can go back to the kind of the status quo ante and the previous economic organization. And that, yeah. And the other thing that I found interesting, to go to what Mark is saying in the most recent things, the meaning of socialism. I think it's interesting that he dedicated the book to socialists, and he seems so far to be talking very respectfully about the aims of socialism, the social justice aims of socialism, and kind of suggesting to socialists that they themselves would be appalled by the methods that totalitarian states that claim to be pursuing socialist goals actually end up using. And I thought that was an interesting that was unexpected for me. So it was interesting to me, I guess. You're muted.
What's interesting too in this time period, and some of his respect, I think, comes from the fact that for a big chunk of time, he's at the London School of Economics,
Yeah,
which is in part founded by our friend Beatrice Webb, who was a big socialist sympathizer
right,
coming out of the late 1800s into the early 1900s.
right. Who he calls
So,
out, I think, when he talks about men and women who have,
yeah.
whose ideas he's responding to. Yeah.
So the power base at the place from which he's writing
Hmm.
is, if not controlled, at least has some heavy-handed leadership coming from that side of the aisle. So he can't, he may want to be, you know, bigger and louder about it, but people he sees every day walking around campus roughly at this time are,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
but it's also, I think, at a time too where those kind of arguments happened in a political sphere that is not as, split and vituperative as the one we're in now. Although
Yeah.
maybe it was, and it just was that kind of very British, like, I hate you, but I'm not saying it outright, but you can read between the lines and know that I hate you. You know,
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like there is. I don't know. I guess I'll wait for confirmation or disconfirmation as I continue reading. But at this point, my impression is that he is more sympathetic than I had expected him to be of the goals and the ideals of socialists, and just skeptical of whether they have thought through or experienced the actual reality of, and come to grips with the fact that it is idealism, and that there isn't going to be an Owenist utopian uh, settlement at the end of history. And he seems certainly to be arguing against any type of Hegelian or Marxist inevitability, or kind of end of history. So so that, from that perspective, I liked it as well, because that's a historical, in my opinion, kind of a thing. Oh, maybe it's still in the writings of what Hayek called the men and women of science, could not be ignored. And he's quoting in this introduction. So I haven't run into the part yet, but the quote says men parentheses and women exclamation point end parentheses of science within the quote. So apparently that's how Hayek had written it himself, which
Yeah, that
seems
when
to
I
be a
when I
clear reference to Beatrice.
when I try to chase that down, it seems to be a couple of paragraphs in the letters column
Hmm.
of the 1930 whatever copy of Nature, and it does it. There is a second piece that's almost the same title that is more of a complaint from the various technicians, scientists, engineers who think that their above and beyond skills are not being used sufficiently well in the war effort.
Yeah.
But it seemed an odd piece to reference. It doesn't seem to go very.
Hmm. It's interesting too, the connection with the Fabian Society that you mentioned in the in the chat, Tim, because I have this. I want to track it down, but I've been sort of holding on to this description that I ran into of the Fabians in, I don't know, I think it might have been one of Taleb's books, where he sort of focused on the fact that they moved very slowly and that their deliberate choice to move very slowly and to emulate and to take their name, after the the cunctator, the delayer, that was some type of a relevant, kind of political response to, maybe the sort of inherent idealism and unworkability of the ultimate kind of goals that they had. I don't know.
Well,
I'll have to read more about
well,
that.
their part of their basis was gradualism and incrementalism as opposed to revolution.
Right.
So in the so when you sort of read things in and around the likes of sort of like Sherlock Holmes type stories and Ernest Childers with uh, early espionage stories that were
Mhm.
focused very much against the Russians, stroke the new Germans, as it were. It was the various East European and German terrorists come revolutionaries were it. It was never a homegrown outside of the Irish problem. And although they obviously got subject to interest from special grant to come MI5, what is now MI5, they were always, as you say, they were never revolutionary, they were always evolutionary, if you see
Mhm.
that. And and it's part and parcel of their, as you say, part and parcel of their methodology. They're not going to rush anywhere unless somebody shouts fire
Mhm.
in public buildings, often theatre. Um, but that ultimately became the Labour Party, and that as a party isn't revolutionary, but it's also not necessarily a tortoise either.
Hmm.
Dan, your mention of the Fabian Society reminds me too of some of the reading I'd done into Beatrice Webb. Uh, And I think it was work she was doing the early 1900s up to about 1910, I think. But assuredly, one or two of her publications around that time would have probably influenced Hayek's view of planning because she did a huge deep dive into what were, I think it was known as the principles of 1834 in Britain,
Hmm.
where Britain had a poor law policy that was rolled out, and then it was a governmental top down, but we're going to let the local municipalities kind of decide how they implement it. And they were implemented in a kind of higgledy-piggledy, catch as catch can manner. And she did a huge research project on how they were applied where to see if she could figure out how they worked or worked well or didn't.
Hmm.
And she, created an index card database with so much data just to prove that it was a horrible policy and it was ultimately abolished and then no one spoke of it ever after. but it was a version going back 100 years prior as an effort in Britain that was a kind of centrally planned, this is how we're going to do things. And she proved as a sociologist that was a horrible policy and ultimately not a good thing. And Hayek would have known about it assuredly,
Mhm.
um, in his space at the LSE with things that were going on at that time. So I'm kind of curious to see if I can tease out little bits to show that yes, he would have known about it or mentioned it or quoted it or used things like that in his kind of broader arguments as we go through.
Yeah.
Um,
So that bit of research by Beatrice, have you got a title for that or a link?
Is it on the is it the on the anti-corn law riots, 1834?
um, Here, I'll pull up a couple things that'll give you at least a start into it,
Okay.
and drop it in the chat. But it was the English poor law policy from, I think, what, 1834, if I remember. And then she wrote and debunked it in a book or a paper called English Poor Law Policy in 1910.
Hmm.
And I mentioned it, I think, briefly when we were looking at
Yeah.
white trash.
Right.
But this is, where all this stuff is fun, especially digging into stuff like older Hayek,
Right.
where you can kind of put together, you
Hmm.
know,
Hmm.
where it's
Yeah.
been fun for me kind of putting together these quirky little things that
Right.
I've read 40 or 50 years before him and
Mhm.
20 or 30 years, 50 years after him.
Yeah. Well, and the things that he is actually responding to, again, because I think I'm responding to things in what I had said earlier was, I might want to write about, the things that I'm responding to that are unexpected, that may not be the things that everybody remembers, that knows Hayek for. I think that similarly he's responding to things probably in the British Poor Laws, but also I want to track down the exact quote that he references from Tocqueville, right? Because it sounded, that when that was brought up, it sounded like, well, that's an interesting those are some that's an interesting thought to put in Tocqueville's mouth. And then there's a part where he says, and I think I'm still going through my highlights of the introduction here, but just quoting him saying, I think what is needed is a clear set of principles which enables us to distinguish between the legitimate fields of government activities and the illegitimate fields of government activity. You must cease to argue for and against government activity as such, which is like, oh, okay, not what I was expecting to hear. Um, So yeah, and so I think that along the, I think that there are going to be some interesting little surprises like that. And then that that rolled right into the next paragraph was where he comments on tariffs, which I'm sure nobody who's supporting the current administration has read. Although they think they like Hayek quite a bit.
Well, that's the curious thing too, is and I haven't even delved into some of the Austrian School of Economics links
Hmm.
and how there's an idea of who Hayek is in the zeitgeist, but looking back at him, and I think it's important too to look at the history of what has formed his thought to this point. But it's super fascinating to see how applicable he is to now
Yeah,
in his original incarnation
right.
versus the what we think we know about Hayek. Um,
Right. Well, and it's yes, yeah, absolutely. And it's also interesting to me to see these, kind of interventions happening in time because, my previous experience with the Austrians has been big, green leather-bound volumes of, of Human Action or the complete works of Mises or the Theory of Money and Credit or, Boym Barwick's, collected works. And in the introduction, there's this kind of back and forth. Okay, so Hayek is doing this thinking and writing these articles. And it does sound, I mean, to what you were saying earlier, Chris, it does seem like this is an ongoing conversation that's being had throughout the 1930s. Because, Boym Barwick was over reading a seminar paper at this place, and Mises is intervening somewhere else on some other topic, and this body of thinking is kind of evolving in reaction to politically what's happening at the time, which is interesting to me because I hadn't, I had been sort of conceptually aware that the Austrian school is a response to, not only the Russian Revolution, but the rise of fascism in Europe.
Yeah.
But seeing it actually playing out in real time is interesting.
Well, I don't know if the group who was financing all these economists in the US
Mhm.
had a name, but it seems to be the same sort of playbook um, that the Heritage Foundation has essentially played in legal circles in America since at least the early 70s, where we want the world and the society and the US in particular to move in this direction. So we're going to actively fundraise and find and put these people into places of power and position and actively recruit the next generation of people to come in after them.
Right.
Um, the
Right. Well,
difference here is we seem to be sitting with the so places like the Heritage Foundation still have sway within the current administration, but to a great extent, broad America and the populist movement seem to be pushing us away from, and we see it every day in the, anti-science, anti-Harvard piece that's going on now is like, we can't trust the experts. So a lot of this political economic theory is more of a piece of the Reagan Bush years. Whereas there seems to be no driving economic theory being pushed out by the current administration, who just seems to want to push chaos. Um,
yeah, I think that I think yeah, there was, and one of the things that we read, I don't know, a couple of years ago, kind of had at least a partial sort of a genealogy of, I mean, Aaron Director is certainly important, and the people who were around in Chicago, who led to. But there was a guy, whose name is escaping. It'll probably pop into my head in 10 minutes. There was a guy that I think was mentioned in something that we read, who I think was a big kind of funder of it. And then there was Leonard Reed at the Foundation for Economic Education, which used to be in Irvington, New York, um, and people associated with that. Henry Hazlitt, who is mentioned in one of the introductions, was a long-standing kind of commentator on the um, on the conservative slash libertarian, kind of free market maximalist side. He wrote a book, a very derivative book, called Economics in One Lesson, which I think he signed for me when I met him at Fee one time. I don't have it anymore. Uh, but yeah, I think there was a lot of this was sort of, Mont Pelerin and Chamber of Commerce kind of associated and funded, but led to, kind of at a higher, more intellectual, academic level, led to, I think Aaron Director led directly to Chicago School. And then that whole, and we did somebody, who was it that gave us that whole kind of jaded view of the all the effort to endow uh, professorial positions with, and make them available to
Was
these.
that in Tim Lacey?
Might have been. Was it Tim? Or yeah, it was about that same time that we were reading Tim.
Or it may have been in a piece of it in Donut Economics,
Might have been, or in
touched on some of it.
Conway and Oreskes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Or it's been kind of slightly echoed and shadowed in all of them in
Yeah.
some sense.
Yep. Yep. Well, and that's the thing, is that this is, to a great extent, a lot of the stuff we've been reading has sort of taken this as propaganda, right? And as kind of a promotion uh, of this position, as sort of from the perspective of sort of a self-interested, kind of propaganda perspective, which, um, which I'm not, I guess I'll wait and see if, this book, the one thing that did jump out at me was the very kind of straight treating of the treatment of the Reader's Digest condensation, which, the way that we've read about it in the past has been depicted
Trader Joe's.
as this kind of bastardization and kind of dumbing down, and propagandization of the ideas that Hayek had come up with. People still tend to go off half-cocked about it. Why don't they read it and find out what Hayek actually says, according to who's John Schoon says, of the Reader's Digest thing. So
Well, that's the kind of useful pieces. I think this Hayek is so recent still in the span of, let's say the broader great thought or the great books.
yeah,
I see aren't behind you today, Dan. Um,
yeah,
but it's part of that ongoing conversation, but it also requires the work to read and participate in the conversation. And I think it's in a world of, scrolling and little tiny snippets of information that most people would rather get their details from,
yeah,
you know, you're gonna get, and I think it was 2 weeks ago we were talking about cherry picking our information in a way that creates the world we live in without actually fully understanding it all.
yeah,
And then I think you mentioned, the cognitive bias of, hey, I've seen this before. It sounds familiar, so it must be true. I'll believe it.
hmm
Um,
yeah,
and it feeds into that. So it also makes me wonder who were the other people around um, him or that era that if you were still adding books to the great book series, who would you throw in
right,
from the early 20th century as pivotal in those forms of thought? The people like Karl Popper, let's say,
right,
who, I hear at least one reference a month to Karl Popper.
sure.
Um, but that may also be just indicative of the stuff I'm seeing and reading.
Are there
Well,
those?
the other thing is you seeing or reading. If you do it via, at the extreme, and I'm trying to definitely not make this some sort of intellectual slur. If you do it via something like Facebook, the fact that you've done 3 or 4 Karl Popper pieces last month guarantees you'll get 4 or 5 this month and maybe 10 next month.
Hmm.
So that self-reinforcement is a problem. And of course, it also appears, even if you do it via you know, the Google search type thing, if we sat down with our over a Zoom call and put the same request into a Google search,
Hmm.
your answers and my answers would be different
Hmm.
because we've got a different location and a different history. So unless you find a search engine that is linked into, say, hypothesis, or maybe just it might even be something that you just need to do. Oh, let's go to the Library of Congress and ask questions into the library search.
Hmm.
But I don't know whether some of those may have already uh, effectively subcontracted their search into Google. I mean, this is where one of those big problems I got with the Guardian newspaper, for instance. Guardian newspaper, when you search the Guardian newspaper, it's a cut down version of Google search.
Hmm.
Whereas, for instance, I mean, you've just had Francesca Gina fired by Harvard for the plagiarism thing that's been going on with Dan Ari 10 years ago now. They finally got off their arse and fired her. Mostly, I think, because she's been a pain in their ass by trying to sue them so much.
Yeah.
So I saw a comment that somebody had done a screenshot from the Daily Mail, and I just won't any more than I wouldn't necessarily go to various TV stations. I just won't shovel shit out of Daily Mail, as in, this is the British newspaper that was founded by the person who loved Hitler. I'm just
Hmm.
not going to go there. Plus the fact it was a screenshot, so there's nothing I could link to. So I thought, oh, it's topical. It's happened this week.
Hmm.
It must be news on the BBC. And so I typed in Harvard and something, Harvard firing, because I couldn't remember the person's name. And in the screenshot, the person's name wasn't there. How could you do that?
Hmm.
And although it's not very structured at the BBC, it went back to 2014 and no mention of Francesca Gina or Dan Hayek, Dan Ari. And it was like, okay, I've got books by Dan. I'm sure it was Dan.
Hmm.
Let me get his surname because I couldn't remember his surname, other than it was begin with A. But it wasn't that much of a search from my book list.
Hmm.
And then it's like, okay, put his name in a Google search as opposed to a search in the BBC. And it's like the second or third item.
Hmm.
And then, yeah, I remember now because it was like 3 years ago, particularly since we've been speaking, because at one point I spoke to you, Dan, about, oh, have you heard of the plagiarism stroke corruptness of the data
Hmm.
thing? Have you heard of Dan Ari? And he's relatively accessible,
Yeah.
but I've got nothing written by Francesca Gino.
Hmm.
I don't think she's actually written a book, but it's not her area. Is not something I would necessarily dip into. And yeah, and Facebook, or as I normally refer to it as Fastbook, its search is appalling, and and as is the level of threading that you could get if you try and have a complex conversation.
Hmm.
Um, so, but it's I can see the searching challenge will come when we're trying to get hold of these March lap correspondence
Yeah.
and
Well,
see how
right.
accessible they are.
Well, and it's interesting to me that there seems like there was a conversation about this book when it came out. There's a review in the New Republic. There are a bunch of, they talk about a bunch of different things. I mean, they even quote, in this review in the New Republic, Alvin Hansen apparently says that, that Hayek distinguishes between good planning and bad planning, but doesn't
Yeah, and in that context,
draw the line between the two. And then
yeah,
Keynes says it's a grand book, and I find myself in agreement with virtually the whole of it, and deeply moved, but he goes on to say, you admit here and there that it's a question of knowing where to draw the line. You agree that the line has to be drawn somewhere, and that the logical extreme is not possible, but you give us no guidance whatever as to where to draw it. So I thought that was
but with the in the intros, stroke prefaces that I sort of maybe wasted a bit of time on relative to Chris, there was the talk of this is like going to be like a 3,000 copy book.
mhm.
And by the time that this version came out, there's it's if I remember right, the number was 350,000 copies in the
Yeah,
US.
yeah.
So so clearly it touched a nerve somehow or somewhere. Um, but it's um, clearly a crossover in terms of as Chris mentioned about the Austrians in general, which I thought was a bit of a unfortunate crossover, given that Hayek is purely Austrian educated,
Mhm.
but not that Austrian. Albeit he came from the Austrian school, I suppose Chicago school. But um, the the Austrian school is clearly a thing that is attacked by the likes of Naomi Ostraces and Naomi Klein as being the source of much badness for the big corporate, etc. And
Well,
there's a
and also
discussion.
kind of the philosophical underpinning of kind of libertarianism in general, and especially, because Ayn Rand wasn't an economist at all. She just kind of defaulted to the Austrians, and she used to wave, Ludwig von Mises around like crazy. So that I think was yeah, I think that, as Pat said, it was, the Chicago got it published in the first place, but probably, and I think as we've seen, I still agree with, with the depiction of it being the Reader's Digest. Even if it, whether or not it was propaganda, the Reader's Digest certainly was the thing that kind of put it on the map for Americans, and probably was much more read. I mean, even if 350,000 copies of the Hayek book were sold, they may have just gone on people's shelves,
Yeah.
who got most of their understanding of it from the Reader's Digest version, or even the Look magazine cartoon version.
Yeah. I'm curious. I don't know if anybody's ever done a rough guesstimate in a ranking, but there are lots of books that no one reads, but everyone has.
Yeah.
So assuredly, the Bible is probably at the top of the list for the most purchased and least read volume.
Yeah.
And then I've heard anecdotal evidence that Stephen Hawking's book, A Short History of Time, or
Yeah. Yeah.
was a massive bestseller, but that probably almost no one read, or if anyone read, they didn't understand it all.
Hmm.
But then have to be things like this, or all the books that every college assigns and no one reads. But
Right.
I know that problem is much deeper as a thing. So it's a question of what's being assigned the most to know what's being read the least.
Right.
Um, but I'm curious where this book would rank in that hierarchy. Would it make the top 10?
Yeah. Yeah. It might.
You know, and
Hmm.
then versus other things like you could take things from popular culture, like you know, the Kardashians TV show that everybody talks about, but it's obvious everyone's actually watched it.
Yeah.
And
It's
I'll note for historicity that I have seen more than one episode of that stupid show
have you? Okay.
to be able to talk about it. So
The other obvious one to me is hands up the people who've never seen an episode of A Game of Thrones. But
I've never
then
seen.
hands up,
Wow.
never seen.
Wow.
I've seen a couple of clips, but that's about it. But hands up who's seen every episode of The Wire or um,
I've never seen
the
an
new,
episode. I've never
the
watched a single
news.
episode of The Wire
It's
or The Worst Wing.
excellent, excellent. But I was going to say the other one, yeah, for newsroom.
I, you know, I've seen the newsroom at least 3 times all
Oh,
the
I've
way
only seen
through.
that one episode with the speech in it.
Oh, the first episode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. My sister made me watch it. God, Leonard Pykoff is still around. I remember reading the Ominous Parallels when it came out.
Speaking of which, while we're talking about all this, and we haven't yet had, I thought for sure Tim was going to say West Wing so we could, get our drink in.
Hmm.
But I wanted to note with some reverence the passing of Valerie Mahaffey, who most of the world knows from her work in, I think, Northern Exposure.
Oh.
And I worked with her for about a year in the mid 2000s. But we all know her better as um, Tawny Cryer from season 3 of The West Wing. She was the woman who came in and had a conversation with Toby about NEA funding and all the quote unquote crap that people were doing. And she was the one that made the reference, this guy took all of his possessions and burned them you know, in Berkeley. And Sam said, "Oh, I've done that a couple times. I didn't know there was funding available." But she died yesterday, and she is kind of, we could use her as an icon of Republican defunding of useful things in government. And I
Mhm.
find it highly satisfying, even though she was a nice, lovely woman, that somehow she dies of cancer the same day Elon Musk leaves the White House was just a very apropos thing. So,
Mm.
to Valerie Mahaffey.
All right. Yeah. It's yeah, I don't know what to make of oh, Zoom wants me to confirm that we're speaking English. Yeah, we're speaking. Thank you, Zoom. Okay.
I don't know. But
Yeah.
I will say, I think it's interesting too, um, that of books we've read recently, we're actually spending more time delving into the actual book and how it relates to other books than we have on, probably the last dozen things.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I think that's probably accurate.
I say as I lead us promptly off course. So somebody mentioned de Tocqueville and get us back on.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's interesting that that Hayek apparently thought that that Paul Samuelson had it in for him. I thought that was an interesting little bit of correspondence between that's mentioned in the introduction between Hayek and Samuelson, saying I can only take it as as sort of a deliberate um, kind of misrepresentation and libel on me that you've drawn this diagram that puts that makes the distinction much more uh, black and white than than I had wanted to make it, which was which was interesting because that goes on somewhere along the lines we read when we were reading about Samuelson before. The thing that jumped out at me was and I hadn't I mean, and I don't think I have a copy. I used to have a copy. I don't think I do anymore. Um, that It is very diagrammatic. It is very, the circular flow model is a plumbing, diagram, metaphor, diagram kind of thing. Um, and and that kind of goes back to what you were, what you put in the chat, Mark, about the, popularization and, and the level of, kind of detail and complexity that can be, um, that can be available in something that is um, kind of being put out there for the mass market. But again, I think we probably underestimate that. We probably make some assumptions that maybe underestimate the amount of if it's if it seems to me that a lot of academics don't make a huge, don't make really much of an attempt to write plainly.
Yeah. Or they worry. I had a friend who um he was an expert in Italian literature, and he said, I worry that I write papers and journal articles that four people in the world will ever read, and none of the other stuff that I think about will impact the world.
Hmm.
Um, so he, in his late career, wrote a book. He wrote several books on um, civility, and we got him on Oprah
Mm.
for a short little, I don't know, it was like a 10-minute segment, I think.
Wow.
And his book on civility sold into the millions,
Wow.
and in part because he was on Oprah with it. Um, and it just pleased him so much that writing about how to be a better person, becoming a popular
Hmm. Yeah.
bestseller
Yeah.
was a thing
Hmm.
because he had an outsized impact because of it. Um, but he wouldn't have been able to have written it without having read all the Italian greats and I'm sure he had and read everything in the Great Book series,
Hmm.
and a lot of it is quoted in his books on civility.
Yeah.
Um, but I think he was thrilled that other than kind of influencing the 10 or 20 kids he had in class every time he taught something
Right.
on one of those topics, he
Right.
was able to influence them not only on the topic, but how to live a better life and
Yeah.
eventually make it to the level of an Oprah, book mention.
Yeah. That seems like a dream come true for, for somebody who wants to, kind of distill a lifetime of scholarship into something, kind of practical and useful for the general public and then have it
Yeah.
recognized. Yeah.
But I suspect the people who read any of his books on civility, only maybe two of them delved into the rest of his bibliography to see what he had to say about, Plutarch.
Right. Yeah. 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 The yeah. Yeah, that is interesting. How do you what do you do with what you've learned in the academy? The thing that jumps out in my imagination is Name of the Rose. Um, that just like wow. All the stuff that Echo is known for academically, and then that, which was
Yeah.
which is exceptional, to be able to pull that off, you know, having,
Oh, and there's no way he writes that book without the years of,
right.
historical research.
Yeah, right.
Um,
But the years of historical research are not, I mean, you have to have that plus the genius and the ability to write that book. They don't, that's really rare. So interesting. Yeah. But yeah, to get back to this, yeah, I think I think it's kind of cool that the long I'm just I'm still kind of going through I've got on my screen, I've got the thing, that the Bruce Caldwell um, introduction is so heavily endnoted. I think there's a lot of I hadn't really looked at them previously, but I think there's probably going to be a lot in there. Um,
I'm kind of, I would love to see like a Norton Critical edition of this that
mhm.
comes with, contemporaneous reviews of the book when it originally came out or pieces thereafter.
Yeah,
What was the review of this book in 1983,
yeah.
by somebody, in a positions of power and or authority to kind of track that shift
Mhm.
over
That should
time.
that should be easily searchable. But thinking about just expanding up slightly on the linkage in our own reading within the group versus linkage to things we've read before or outside the group.
Mhm.
Um, there's a bit art in the early section um, where he gets out, starts the phrase toys out round about planning. And it's also coming to with the letters to Marchlat. Just after that got introduced, there is a line about grab it for a second. Uh, the freedom and the economic system. First part of a book would be called Hubris, and the second Nemesis.
Yeah.
And I go, whoa! I know those titles. They happen to be the titles by Ian Kershaw of the biography of Hitler.
Hmm.
So it's the pre the war and then after the war starts.
Hmm.
That's the hubris versus nemesis. And I'm wondering, I didn't go back and check to see if, for whatever reason, Kershaw had picked up on that set of titles because of the link to Hayek. It would be a stretch, but possibly not that bad a stretch. But it's so obviously a, a, a very appropriate set of titles on the character. But it
Hmm.
would be I ought to go back and have a look just
Yeah.
to just to see. If not, why not? Almost.
Right.
But there's the linkages on and off the immediate page versus previous group readings. And because of the discussions, it's like also back on the planning, there's a conversation quote between Hayek and Lionel Robbins in the economic planning and the economic order of the 19, as the book in the 1937. And of course, Lionel Robbins is the name of the London School of Economics library that I got involved with in like 2000, 2001,
Hmm.
2001. Um, and so in reading this, I've been going, on a minute, uh, while I was doing the Lionel Robbins library rebuild, they actually closed the library for like 9 months while we redid the building. I can't believe what the students must have been putting up with.
Hmm.
Um, and I think my last day on the project was like the end of the first week after the librarians had put all the books back. And so it was probably the only time that they were perfectly in order, in theory at least.
Hmm.
Uh, but uh, and I don't recall in any previous conversations, not so much with us per se, but about Hayek's book work or the stuff that has been used by him and others based on the road to serfdom,
Hmm.
um, as to whether or not he was at he was at the LSE, other than I suppose, why would he not be if he sort of escaped from Nazism because of good reasons?
Hmm.
Um, I hadn't realised that he was at LSE, but why would he not be? Because he's that size of person, and I hadn't realised either just how much time he'd spent there, and or that it's clearly spent that amount of time in the UK, and was initially because he's only a new nationalised citizen. We don't want you in the war effort.
Hmm.
Either that seemed a bit unfair,
Yeah.
but see
Yeah.
see if it comes up later again.
Right. Right. Well, I think it was, yeah, it's interesting that the identification of a second acquired seems, oh, responding to to the thing that was the link. Okay, gotcha. Gotcha, Mark. Yeah, I thought it was interesting the way Hayek sort of distinguished between liberalism and conservatism, which meant something much different. Oh, there he goes. Okay. Um, which I thought meant something, I obviously meant something very different in the 40s or 50s than it did or the 30s. I think by the time he wrote, I think it was in the preface to the 1956 anniversary edition that he talked about true liberalism is still distinct from conservatism, and there's danger of the two being confused. And then he kind of defines them both. Conservatism being paternalistic, nationalistic, and he also says power adoring, which I think, obviously liberalism may not have been at the time. Liberalism may have been more counterculture, but certainly has become more amenable to power. So yeah, so I guess, all of that is to say that, these sort of generic terms continue to be redefined. And then he talks a lot about, oh, thanks. Thanks for the Valerie Mahaffey. That's, um, yeah, I gotta follow up on this Tocqueville new kind of servitude idea. Um, because that seems like a different take than his the things that he's normally known for. I like it when that happens.
Well, I love the way this piece ties into, in odd ways, lots of our other reading,
Hmm.
um, and mentions along the way. We should, feel like we should be doing this more often with some slightly older books that inform the
Yeah.
current books we're
Hmm.
reading or talking about, or at least that are in the zeitgeist, that
Right.
rather than reading the new thing that just fell off the shelves last
Yeah,
month.
exactly.
Although, although I will say, starting out with, you know, um, Graeber's original book a million years ago was a great thing. But finding pieces like that that are as influential as I presume that will be over the next 100 years don't happen every day. So,
Right.
Well,
No, yeah.
Graeber's mentioned in some of the references here as one of the people that has spoken of Hayek. So in your little list of criticisms, you probably find that if you search in the book, assuming you've got an electronic copy, search in the book for Graeber,
Oh, well.
and you'll get another clearly slightly more contemporary cross-reference.
I'm searching, not seeing them, but I'll follow up on that later. Um, yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah, as I'm kind of zipping through his, from yeah, these things are they're well documented. Um, I do think it's interesting to have these, these prefaces from different editions and to see, kind of how um, his thinking, about it, about what's relevant, what responses were, touched him and what, which ones didn't, and that sort of thing, um, are kind of interesting. And the things that he's still, that in the 1976 edition, he's still, talking about from the 30s and the things that he sort of left behind. Um, yeah, I do think that it's interesting that he wants to seems at least in the first couple of chapters seems to want to distinguish between ideals and rhetoric, and actions and actual policies, and programs and things like that, which I hadn't been expecting either. Most of the time seems like economists want to, mostly want to talk um, about theoretical differences or rhetorical differences and not, not actually kind of what's going on the ground. When we were talking about, kind of socialism and fascism, it's sort of like, well, okay, um, where do you put, the Chicago School and Pinochet?
Yeah. Well, I remember too, reading about there was a history professor who had a massive Zettelkasten that he used to collect snippets out of contemporary newspapers for his historical work.
Mm.
He never really wrote huge amounts, but he primarily used it for teaching,
Hmm.
and he modeled the creation of it. And he actually included cards that were submitted by students into it, but he actively used it for teaching his history students. Um, if I want to remember, I think it was Jason Lustig who wrote about it. Deutsch, which you can find in my own digital version.
Mm.
But having, as a history teacher, having that kind of contemporaneous set of data while you're talking about the history of teaching history, and then to be able to pull out current examples of things and how they relate. So, in our case, how do you talk about Hayek and then have examples of things that relate back to Hayek
Hmm.
while talking about and teaching and doing these pieces?
Right.
Um, and in his article, Jason Lustig called, you know, he called it, he used the word chips as if like the guy was a woodworker and these are the little chips that fall onto the workroom floor as the
Hmm.
trash and detritus of a teaching career. And
Yeah.
it was kind of done in a pejorative sense. Like this guy had this great workshop and here's all these chips that
Mm.
represent his life's work. But at least, in some sense, he mentions the influence that had on the students.
Hmm.
Um, but it's really how do you do it's the importance of the process of doing it and
Yeah.
being able to tie it back to something concrete, which happens less and less in kind of our social media world or even in the daily news.
Yeah.
You get the news of this thing happened, and there are on Fox News, they're kind of twisting it in the analysis sections later at night.
Right.
They'll recap what happened and then try and tie it back to whatever social agenda that they've got.
Hmm.
But we're really lacking solid TV shows and media that say, hey, this happened today, but here's how it ties back to some solid philosophical appearance
Right.
that's supported by actual evidence.
Right.
And there that piece, I think the Sunday morning shows in the 50s, 60s, 70s did that really well. But I feel like we've, as a culture, have lost the ability to tie those things together and have a common vernacular. Because usually it used to be you showed up on those Sunday morning shows and you would tie it back and create reasoning
Hmm.
that everyone had a base of knowledge. But now those shows mostly are just try and repeat your talking points as many times as you can because those
Right.
are the snippets that are going to show up on YouTube and TikTok and social media
Right.
and not anything to do with the actual physical argument of the thing you're trying to make.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah. Well, and along those lines, that's one of the things that I've been curious about is has been sort of the what Hayek said versus the ways that Hayek has been used or misused in the,
yeah. Or
supposedly
misinterpreted.
misinterpreted. Yeah, yeah, and that was, and I mean, and for Austrian economics, that I've probably already mentioned this in the past, but I think the biggest ever instance of that was Ronald Reagan at one point said that Ludwig von Mises was his favorite economist, um, which was absurd. Um, I don't believe, I didn't believe at the time, and I still don't believe that Ronald Reagan ever read Ludwig von
Yeah.
Mises. But and certainly, I mean, a big aspect of his magnum opus, Human Action, was that, and I think this was fairly consistent throughout Austrian theory, was that values were inherently subjective. And so you really couldn't objectify them, right? There was no objective there, that could allow you to aggregate to a supply curve or a demand curve, right? So that whole idea of economic analysis was kind of invalidated by kind of the basic philosophical premise of the subjectivity of value. And so, which kind of cut the bottom out of,
Yeah.
micro theory, much less macro theory.
Yeah.
Uh, so but then nobody who was kind of waving around, the Mises name or the Austrian school's, credentials as a libertarian inspiration really cared.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's part of the kind of disintegration of where we are now is Ronald Reagan, who, is born and raised in middle of nowhere farmland, Dixon, Illinois, becomes famous as an actor and then becomes a governor and a politician. But to
Mhm.
seem legitimate to the intelligentsia of the day, pulls out a well-known economist and says this guy's the greatest. And
Mhm.
did anybody question him on, okay, what specifically within his work
Right.
do you think is the greatest? The same way, in the first election, like, okay, Donald Trump, what's your favorite passage from the Bible that you love so much? Like,
Yeah.
but no one questions him and presses him on him, or if they do, the electorate who is supporting him does not seem to care at all.
Right.
And these are the people who are the super Christians. Like,
Hmm.
it seems reasonably obvious that, the guy can't even tell you what the golden rule was. Like, just like, if you wanted to sum
Whoever
up the
whoever
whole
dies with the
thing,
most gold wins. Isn't that the rule?
yeah, no, the most golden toilets, he
Yeah.
wins.
Right.
Um, I think that's the golden rule. In that case, but we don't, you know, people talk about, can you show the receipts?
Yeah.
But even if you show the receipts, nobody seems to care anymore.
Hmm.
And I'm really am waiting for the the pendulum to swing back in the other direction, where having some kind of, like, or it's the West Wing quote of, I'm looking for a mind at work,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know.
Hmm. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Well, and that's and it's kind of weird because it seemed like there was a promise of that, or there was maybe not a full-on promise, but the suggestion of a promise of that when people started saying, hey, wait a minute, folks are watching long form podcasts, and these things that are an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours long. Um, and and it seemed for a while like that was kind of a hopeful development. That maybe there was an ability in a bigger thing, in a bigger format than, we've got 7 minutes and then we go to commercial, on cable news, that a train of thought could be developed or an argument could be presented that was more, um, that had more steps in it, or that was a little more, complicated or nuanced or whatever. Um, I'm not sure that that has materialized. I think there have been a couple of, I mean, I can think of a couple of examples of that, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that a possibility potential still exists, or whether it's been, um, whether maybe it's been realized or maybe it's been squandered. I'm not sure.
The
Uh,
other, the
yeah,
other
as the other book
obvious,
on complexity, what is it? Somebody I just saw somebody, Donella Meadows,
yeah.
systems was just brought up in
Well,
something I listened
that
to.
that that's another one that I would have thought about. Although it's it has a certain amount of philosophy, politics, stroke economics within it,
Hmm.
but it's much more technical on the actual what I almost think of as systems engineering. But yeah, it'd be a good excuse to reread and in the context of the group. Um,
Hmm.
but in terms of where Chris mentioned about the profitability of this read being mentioned by a good number of other ones, I think you, as I said on the quote or on the chat, you probably have to go back 50 plus years. And I was trying desperately to think of something that wasn't written by Aristotle or something that was 50 years old. Um, but had had a good link to here in terms of the general perception of what he wants to read. And it's probably worth poking back at a few of the books to see what references they made rather than just trying to pop up with a book. Otherwise, you're going to end up, from my perspective, limiting to what I've already read once type thing,
Hmm.
or know of
Right.
that I know of, but is not yet on my I've read that,
Yep.
so let's put that in.
Right. Well,
Or
I haven't read the Meadows book on systems, actually. So I might be interested. It's kind of weird though. I mean, if you go back 50 years, if you go back 75 years, there are interesting things that just come up in, random science fiction stories. Um, back in the golden age of science fiction,
yeah,
there was there was a series that I liked, that was just kind of an adventure series, but it was by A.E. Van Vogt, and it was called The Players of Null A, and
yeah,
it is about non-Aristotelian thinking, and Korbisky's ideas of general semantics, and just he just threw it all in there. And then he had another series. He had a weapon shops series that was kind of an anarcho, libertarian thing. And he was just kind of a second-rate science fiction, pulp science fiction writer. So things ideas
yeah.
you way
I,
into.
I must I must admit I quite like the players of Norwich. Um, the other ones, of course, is in the same vein would be things like The Caves of Steel by Asimov, or
Hmm.
even you um, a Bradbury Martian Chronicles type thing.
Hmm.
But then I think of what, what's really changed other things. And then I end up by thinking almost further back, and you've got to go and look at, say, uh, Thomas Paine or Thomas Locke even, as being how far do we go back? What's a fundamental thing? And rather like uh, Chris mentioned about what's the most unread book on the shelf.
Hmm.
And the the other thing that sprung to mind when he said that, because he said the Bible, I went the Quran. Uh, Partly because my copy of the Quran probably has been read less than my old copy of the Bible. But then
Hmm.
I went to a Church of England school, so it
Hmm.
was, you had,
So you had to, yeah.
uh, weekly lessons. If yeah, 2 hours a week of divinity instruction, which was mostly off the Bible, but occasionally sort of went sideways on morals and stuff, but not
Hmm.
much.
Hmm.
Um, and so the other thing that struck me, oh God, I've forgotten what the title was now. Oh yeah, the other one that sort of struck me was something like Lyell or Darwin from a geological point of view.
Hmm.
How I mean, I still did geology in the ordinary exam level in '75, and even though uh, continental drift and plate tectonics was being taught at university level in the UK, it hadn't gone down to the schools. So we were still using Lyell's book for geology. And it's at that point, I think it was like 100 and something years old.
Hmm.
Uh, this, uh, so it, the other source of where we might look for, the other one that I would think of would be very useful because it's now must be 30 years old now, is Bill Bryson's Short History of Everything. I know we spoke about Hawkins' book, being something that was on the shelf that nobody had read,
Hmm.
or very few people had read. But it's actually a quite a readable book, and it's not that long. But
Yeah.
Open Society would be, yeah, my first. Downside is you need the double volume,
Hmm.
so that makes it a bit longer.
Hmm.
Um, Otherwise, as in the context of what we've read so far elsewhere, Hayek's a bad person. So why are we reading Hayek? And the only other person I think outside of the likes of Friedman, stroke other Austrians in that context, the only other person I can think of off the top of my head that is similarly blackened is Arnold. So is there do we read the Fountainhead, but from a political, economic, philosophical point of view? Or is there a non-fiction Rand that would be profitable to read?
She didn't write anything very long. There are a bunch of sort of collections of essays, books that um, honestly, I'm not sure how profitable it would be for us to really read that much about objectivism or, her ideas of aesthetics or, there are a couple of shorter essays, virtue of selfishness, things like that. Um, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure that they would. I mean, I guess it's been 30 years since I've, 40 years since I've read them, and when I read them, I was a believer, and I can't, and so they were meaningful to me at the time, but not sure that they would be, that I wouldn't just.
Yeah, and following on a bit from the conversation we had before we picked the current book, where I very rebelling against like the third book in a row on American poverty, American race, who didn't seem to know the answer,
Mhm.
um, and was pushing for something a bit more scientific type thing. And then realised about Hayek and managed to get that argument through. There's I can't think of anything that is, as I say, you've got to go sort of this side of Darwin and the other side of Trantor, I suppose, to get something. There's got to be a history one. And or you pick on something like Charles Bronski, with the Ascent of Man as not being the title, but he's probably got something that would be useful.
Mhm.
Or, and of course, the Ascent of Man is put up against, I forgot what his name is now, but the other guy that worked for the BBC that did the art direction, similar big late 60s, early 70s
Mm.
documentary. Or you end up with something, an early Sagan book to give us a drive or
Mm.
something else.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Who was the
um,
guy, the BBC guy? There was that the guy who did Connections? Wasn't that like James Burke or something like that?
yeah, but he's not, he's a journalist in that context. So he's
Mm.
much more like doing Cosmos type thing. I
Mm.
think there's there was Charles Bronski did this sort of a science and technology thing
Yeah.
as the Ascent of Man, and there was somebody who who fronted a similar uh, series, but was very much art and culture and literature.
Uh-huh.
Oh, Daniel
Who-
Borstein's written a lot of stuff kind of in that genre of essays about broad topic things that he ties his humanities degree into.
Hmm.
it could be. It doesn't have to be a Brit, obviously, just because. But it's uh, just a bit of a pain, not better.
Well, now I
It's got a politician. He was a politician who happened to be good at the humanities art stuff.
Mm.
Um, Clark, Clark with an E on the end from memory.
Clark.
Forget what his first name is.
well
Arthur
I've
Clark? The science
I,
fiction.
I've gone on vacations to places like Savannah, Georgia, and then picked up a copy of, Garden of Midnight of Good and Evil. Or
Hmm.
you travel somewhere and you're like, oh, you know, there's some book on that thing. But I'm kind of curious, Dan, if you surreptitiously picked Hayek as, Austrian school, and I'm going to
Going
Austria.
to
Let's
Austria. I don't know. Are you saying that Hayek was my idea? I don't think it was. I think I agreed. I agreed to it because actually I think
I, I'm definitely hands up. It was my original idea this time round,
yeah.
and thank you for accepting the idea.
No,
Seem to be doing quite well.
I think the reason that I did was, maybe it was because maybe going to Austria was slightly involved. But yeah, it was because I hadn't ever actually read it. I had it on, actually, I don't have it on my shelf anymore. So I had to get a Kindle copy, but I had it on my shelf for the longest time and hadn't read it. It was one of those. The other one that I didn't ha that I never read and loaned out to somebody, I think, was Mises' Theory of Money and Credit. I loaned it to a guy who really got into it and became just a really committed libertarian. So I feel a little bit guilty about that. But it's like
No,
He was reading Ayn Rand long before you gave him that. So
maybe he was. I think he had a midlife crisis though, and then it changed his life. And yeah, so I
was
guess
his middle name Galt by any chance?
no, maybe it is now though. Yeah, he was a very reserved Scandinavian guy. And he just he went kind of crazy with the libertarianism because it just struck the right nerve at the right moment. Yeah. So for next time, let me look at the table of contents. Another. Well, the next five chapters through 10 would take us about another 70 pages. So that would be half of what's left, I think. Well, not quite half. Yeah, half. Yeah, half if we don't count the appendices and all the extra stuff at the end. Yeah, what would John Galt do? Yep. Um, yeah, that was. I loved that book. And when I first read it, when I was 19, although I was never able to really read the entire John Galt speech at the end, which goes on, I think went on in the paperback version that I had. It went on like 80, 90 pages. Um, and it was just too much.
Yeah. Well, the real question though is, did you read the like 20 pages of the description of the carvings on the door at the monastery in The Name of the Rose?
I don't I don't remember them, so maybe I didn't.
I just remember there's this, the great book and there's this lovely plot, but there's this little side diversion of all the weird things going on carved onto this door. And I was like, what was that chapter about?
Yeah. Yeah, that's
And it's odd that I remember this thing that I read in eighth grade,
yep.
decades ago.
Yep. Yeah. So, yeah.
decades. I thought you were younger than that.
So that eighth grade would have been probably 87, 88. I'll let you do the math. It's been a minute.
It's been a minute. That's not a, could have been more of a minute though.
But if you want to skip the naming of a rose, it was plenty of other good echo to do.
Yeah. It's kind of funny. Matt Taibbi and Walter Kern have moved on from short stories to novels apparently this week. And they started with The Quiet American by Graham Greene. So they're gonna focus on novels that they think are both good and significant for our moment, our historical moment. So that'll be interesting to see what kind of a collection they come up with. It's interesting that people are returning to books. Some people.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too when it's um it's nice to have book clubs that are reading fictiony things that you can sit and chew on a little bit, but
Yeah.
I find it more interesting to find groups of people reading the nonfiction stuff that then gives you kind of a common base of here's this thing and let's talk about it the way
Mhm.
we do our pieces.
Yeah.
And maybe we would benefit from having people on the further hard right showing up to talk about their opinions of these things, good, bad, or indifferent, or to
Mhm.
at least be able to make an argument
Yeah.
about them. But the challenging your ideas and preconceptions, but even having just the basic commonality of that thing, that topic to go on as a much the same way everybody talks about Seinfeld.
Yeah.
You all saw it, you all watched it. It's something you now have in common
Right.
to
Right.
talk about versus
It's a cultural touchstone.
opinions.
Yeah. There is, maybe we should read War is a Racket. Another book that I have had on my shelf and I have never read yet. Old Smedley Butler.
Wait, say that book again, Dan?
War is a Racket.
Oh, okay.
Smedley Butler, 1935. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
apparently
yeah.
the thing
That,
that's
that
interesting about him, aside from the fact that he's like the most decorated soldier in American history, is that he had seen so much battle from from the Spanish-American War through the Boxer Rebellion, through just, I mean, one thing after another, from, like the turn of the century to 1935 when he wrote the book. And all of the sort of Caribbean banana interventions and Haitian occupations and that sort of thing. Yeah, that would be that's something that I am meaning to, kind of get to and look at in my prep for US History 2 for the fall. I'm gonna try to update my content for that.
What is the
and I haven't gone down and looked at Pocahontas yet, but I will.
so what's on the summer research program for Dan?
Really mostly just to try to find an equivalent set of primary sources for US History 2 that I did for US History 1, so I can kind of continue that format of having them read, having me lecture and then having them mostly reading primary sources, or at least listening to me narrating them for them.
And which time period does History 2 cover for you?
Reconstruction to the present.
Okay.
So there's a lot. And at some point I run into the reason that I hesitated, I didn't do it as early as the other one was that, at some point I run into the copyright barrier. Um, but the
19,
upside of that is that I also run into the digital media opportunity, right? Where I can have them start listening to, Library of Congress, recordings of fireside chats and,
yeah.
watch the Kennedy Nixon debate on, some I'll find a place where
Yeah.
where I can link to it at least, if not actually, host it in my own volume. But yeah.
Did you ever pick up the Gateway to the Great Books series?
Um
I think there
I
were 10 of them, if I remember. And I think most of their stuff was early American history rather than later, but
I think I have two of them, yeah. But I haven't gotten the rest yet.
that's a quick way to pick up a handful of interesting things potentially without having to do a lot of digging and work.
Yeah. That's a good point. I just jotted that down to remind myself. Yeah, I also have a set of the Annals of America, which have a lot of, kind of a lot of good stuff in them, but they only go to, whenever it was they were published in the 60s or 70s.
Well,